In the summer of 1791, an unnamed servant arrived at Mozart's door with a commission. No name, no patron identified. Just the job. Write a Requiem Mass, for whatever fee he cared to name. Mozart took the money. He needed it. And over the following months, as he worked on this anonymous funeral mass, his health began to collapse. Fever, swelling, headaches that wouldn't stop. By December, he was bedridden, and he knew he wasn't getting up. He told people, repeatedly, that he feared he was writing a requiem for himself. He died on December 5th, 1791. He was 35 years old. The requiem was unfinished. The story that gets told about what happened next goes like this. Mozart told his wife Constanze that he'd been poisoned, that someone had calculated the precise time of his death and commissioned the requiem to force him to write his own funeral mass, that he knew he was dying because he'd been made to die. It's a perfect story. It has a victim, a conspiracy, and a dying genius composing his own funeral music in real time. The only problem is that nearly none of it holds up, and the part that does hold up means something completely different than you've been told. This is what actually happened. Mozart's mythology didn't start after his death. It started while he was still alive. His father Leopold was a court musician in Salzburg, deputy Kapellmeister, a genuinely respectable position by 18th century standards. He supported his family, his compositions circulated beyond Salzburg, and by most measures, he had made it. But he never reached the top job, and he knew it. His letters are full of resentment toward unnamed enemies, paranoia about cabals of rival musicians, and a gnawing sense that the world hadn't given him his due. When he recognized early that his son was something extraordinary, he moved immediately to monetize it. By the time Wolfgang was 7, Leopold had organized a touring concert act built around his two talented children. They performed across Europe for 3 years. Emperors, queens, the Pope. Leopold wrote home in breathless detail about every royal encounter, every standing ovation, every whispered marvel. He was building a brand. The problem with a brand built on supernatural genius is that it needs to keep escalating. A child prodigy who becomes a merely excellent adult composer is a disappointment. So the myth grew to match the reality. Mozart's biographers, most of them writing decades after his death, several of them working from sources Constanze herself approved, began describing his creativity in terms that had nothing to do with human effort. He composed, one biographer wrote, as a silkworm spins silk. Einstein said his music seemed like it had always existed, waiting to be discovered. Tchaikovsky called him the musical Christ. The divine vessel framing served everyone. The people who loved his music needed it to mean something transcendent. The early German romantics wanted to claim him as proof of German cultural supremacy. Constanze had every reason to maximize her late husband's estate value. Nobody had an incentive to tell a simpler story. What that myth required, though, was that Mozart's death be proportionate to his genius. A divine vessel doesn't die of a chest infection during a bad winter. A musical god doesn't get finished off by his own doctor. If Mozart was what everyone said he was, his death needed a villain. It needed drama. It needed to mean something. That need is the engine behind every theory you're about to hear, and the theories get dark fast. The Musikalisches Wochenblatt, a Berlin music publication, ran 2 separate notices about Mozart's death. The first, on December 12, 1791, reported simply that he had died of dropsy of the chest at 35 years of age, to the profound sorrow of all friends of art. No suspicion of foul play, a plain obituary. The second notice appeared on New Year's Eve, 3 weeks later in the same publication, from their Prague correspondent. That one was different.
Mozart is dead. He was sickly when he returned home from Prague and remained ailing since then. He was thought to be retaining water, and he died in Vienna at the end of the last week. Because his body swelled up after death, it is believed that he was poisoned.
That's it. One sentence. No named suspect, no evidence, no source. A rumor printed as a footnote. And it was enough. But the rumor had fuel because Mozart himself had said something similar. During a period of illness in the autumn of 1791, he told Constanza he was sure he'd been given aqua tofana, a legendary poison said to be colorless, tasteless, slow-acting, and untraceable. His symptoms briefly improved. He walked back to claim in mid-November, but in his final delirious hours, the fear resurfaced. Constanza repeated it to researchers years later, and once it was in print, it never left. One thing worth noting about aqua tofana itself, the historical record around it is heavily romanticized. There's no serious scholarly consensus that it existed as a reliable murder weapon. Mozart wasn't describing a real thing he'd been given. He was describing a legend, the kind of thing anxious, feverish people reach for when their bodies are failing and they need an explanation. When the poisoning rumor needed a face, the public reached for Antonio Salieri, a prominent Italian composer, director of Italian opera at the Habsburg court, and later imperial Kapellmeister. The logic was almost entirely circumstantial. Salieri was Italian, Mozart was from Salzburg. We'll leave it at that. The two operated in the same competitive world, therefore rivalry, therefore motive, therefore murder. The historical record doesn't support any of that. Salieri was 6 years older than Mozart, and when they first overlapped in Vienna, was already the most powerful musical figure at the Habsburg court. He had no reason to feel threatened, and far from nursing a secret hatred, the two had a documented friendship. We know this because Mozart's last surviving letter to Constanza, written October 14, 1791, less than 2 months before he died, describes the evening he sent his carriage to collect Salieri and the soprano Caterina Cavalieri to bring them to his private box for a performance of his new opera. Mozart wrote that Salieri watched the entire opera with complete attention, calling out bravo or bello at every number. That's not the behavior of a man planning a murder. The actual Salieri myth was constructed much later. In 1823, Salieri suffered a severe physical and cognitive collapse and was hospitalized. Rumors circulated that he'd confessed to killing Mozart. He hadn't. His pupil, Ignaz Moscheles, visited him and recorded Salieri's explicit denial. His caregivers, Gottlieb Parsko, Georg Rosenberg, and his physician Joseph Röhrig signed a formal declaration stating he never once made such a claim in their presence. Salieri died in 1825. The rumors followed him to the grave, and Alexander Pushkin turned them into a play in 1830. Rimsky-Korsakov turned Pushkin's play into an opera, which premiered in 1898. Peter Schaffer turned Rimsky-Korsakov's mythology into Amadeus in 1979, and Milos Forman turned Schaffer's play into a Best Picture winner in 1984. A rumor with no evidence, laundered through 4 levels of fiction over 160 years, until most people alive today take it as basically true. The final nail. After Mozart died, Constanze needed music teachers for her youngest son, Franz Xaver. She hired the best available in Vienna. For vocal training and compositional mentorship, she hired Antonio Salieri. Salieri publicly predicted the boy would have a career not inferior to that of his celebrated father. You don't hand your child to the man you believe murdered your husband, so Salieri is out. The next theory is bigger, older, and considerably more paranoid. If Salieri didn't do it, the conspiracy theorists had a backup. In 1861, a German philosopher named Georg Friedrich Dahmer, frequently misidentified in secondary sources as G.F. Dahmer, a different person entirely, published a series of articles arguing that Mozart had been executed by Freemasons. The theory went like this: Mozart was a Mason, but he'd grown disillusioned, and he encoded anti-Masonic messages in the magic flute, even revealing secret initiation rites in the opera's structure. When the lodge realized what he'd done, they commissioned the Requiem anonymously as a form of psychological torture, then poisoned him. The timeline alone collapses this. As for the mysterious man who commissioned the Requiem, it wasn't a secret society hitman. It was Count Franz Walsegg, a wealthy aristocrat who had a habit of anonymously commissioning music from professional composers so he could pass it off as his own. His servant collected Mozart's unfinished manuscript after the death, paid the remaining 30 ducats without a word, and was never heard from again. We know the full shape of this transaction because a Munich newspaper reported it on December 27, 1791, 3 weeks after Mozart died, before anyone had heard of poison or conspiracy. No Illuminati, just a plagiarist, and a servant who quietly closed an account. The Requiem Commission almost certainly arrived in mid-July 1791. The Magic Flute didn't premiere until September 30th. Whatever the Masons supposedly found so offensive in the opera, no one had seen it yet when they allegedly decided to kill its composer. And then, according to this theory, they let it run to packed houses for months anyway. The most powerful secret society in Europe, moved to murder over an opera, couldn't be bothered to cancel the production. Daumer's theory found a willing audience among people with far uglier agendas. Hermann Alvad was a primary school principal in Imperial Germany who lost his job after embezzling school funds. Needing a new career, he rebuilt himself as a political agitator, won election to the Reichstag in 1892, and co-founded the Anti-Semitic People's Party in 1895. That was the literal name of the organization. Shortly before his death, Alvad published a 1914 book called Mehr Licht, More Light, claiming that Mozart, Schiller, and Lessing had all been systematically assassinated by a Jesuit Jewish Masonic conspiracy to prevent the rise of a unified German culture. This was later expanded in the 1930s by Mathilde Ludendorff, wife of World War I General Erich Ludendorff, one of the men who helped put the Nazis in power, who argued that Mozart was an Austro-German patriot executed by a globalist cabal of Jews, Catholics, and Freemasons for refusing to write in the Italian style. A casual medical rumor from 1791, mythologized by romantics and dramatized by playwrights, had become a tool of 20th century fascism. That's where the murder theories end up when you follow them to their conclusion. The physical evidence tells a different story. And that story has a twist none of the conspiracy theorists saw coming. Set the murder theories aside for a moment. What does the physical evidence actually show? Mozart was buried in an unmarked communal grave at St. Mark's Cemetery, not because he died penniless, but because that was the law. In 1784, Emperor Joseph II, an Enlightenment reformer with a particular interest in civic hygiene, had decreed that all citizens below the highest nobility were to be buried in simple communal graves outside the city. He even briefly mandated reusable coffins with hinged trapdoors that dropped the body into the earth before the coffin was retrieved. That last part caused such public outrage that it was rescinded 6 months later. The unmarked communal grave requirement, though, remained the legal standard in 1791. Mozart's burial was organized by his patron, Baron Gottfried van Swieten. It was ordinary. It was middle class. It was exactly what the law required. The blizzard, the famous storm that supposedly scattered the mourners at the cemetery gates, was invented by a journalist named Joseph Diener in 1856, 65 years after the fact. Contemporary records tell a different story. The court newspaper, the Wiener Zeitung, noted a light north wind and temperatures just above freezing. No storm, just a grey December day in Vienna. So the grave isn't what the myth says it is, neither is the weather. What about the body itself? Because the grave was communal and unmarked, a gravedigger named Joseph Rothmeyer allegedly twisted a wire around Mozart's neck at burial to identify the location later. When the grave was exhumed a decade on, Rothmeyer reportedly retrieved the skull as a keepsake. It passed through several hands, eventually reaching the Viennese anatomist Joseph Hertel, a devoted phrenologist, before ending up at the International Mozarteum Foundation in Salzburg, where it's been held since 1902. In 2006, the Austrian public broadcaster, ORF, commissioned a forensic project called CSI Mozart, timed to the 250th anniversary of the composer's birth. Geneticists from the University of Innsbruck, led by Walter Parson, along with the US Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Maryland, extracted mitochondrial DNA from 2 teeth in the skull and compared it against bone samples from 2 female skeletons in the Mozart family grave in Salzburg, believed to be Mozart's maternal grandmother and his niece. The skull didn't match the grandmother. The skull didn't match the niece. And then, the grandmother and the niece didn't match each other either. The test commissioned to verify Mozart's skull instead revealed that the Mozart family grave in Salzburg didn't contain the biological relatives everyone assumed were buried there. Someone in the family line had been keeping secrets. The skull's identity remains unresolved. Mozart's actual remains are lost, which means the verdict on his death has to be built from something other than bones. It has to be built from documents, and the documents are more conclusive than anyone expected. Strip away the skull, the conspiracy theories, the mythology. What the documents actually show is a winter epidemic, a documented medical history, and a physician who finished the job the bacteria started. The story of Mozart's death, it turns out, begins not in 1791, but decades earlier, on the road, as a child, under his father's relentless touring schedule. Somewhere between the royal courts and the packed concert halls, and the months away from home, the young Wolfgang contracted rheumatic fever. He recovered. But rheumatic fever is caused by streptococcal bacteria, and the damage it does to the heart and immune system doesn't fully heal. Survive it once, and you carry a vulnerability for the rest of your life. The body remembers. Leopold's tours gave Wolfgang his career. They may also have written the terms of his death. By the autumn of 1791, Streptococcus was moving through Vienna. It wasn't unusual. Winter epidemics were a fact of 18th century urban life. What was unusual was Mozart's particular susceptibility to this one. His immune system had been in a slow negotiation with streptococcal bacteria since childhood, and in December 1791, he lost the negotiation. The fever spiked, his limbs swelled, he couldn't move. By the end of November, he couldn't sit up. On the afternoon of December 4th, the day before he died, Mozart asked friends to come to his bedside and sing through the Requiem with him. His friend Benedikt Schack took the soprano part. His brother-in-law Hofer sang tenor. The bass singer, Franz Xaver Gell, was there. Mozart, bedridden, sang the alto. Schack had created the role of Tamino in The Magic Flute 2 months earlier. Gerl had played Sarastro. Mozart had written those parts for them. According to Schack's later recollection, they were working through the first bars of the Lacrimosa when Mozart began to weep and had to set the score down. He never picked it up again. Dr. Eduard Guldener von Lobes, the medical superintendent for Lower Austria, would later write in an 1824 letter to the composer Giuseppe Carpani,
"He fell sick in the late autumn of a rheumatic and inflammatory fever, which, being fairly general among us at the time, attacked many people, and for not a few of them, it had the same fatal conclusion and the same symptoms as in the case of Mozart.
A contemporary medical official documenting a citywide outbreak with identical symptoms and identical outcomes. The record is about as clear as 18th century medicine gets. Mozart's attending physician was Dr. Thomas Franz Closet, and here is where the story turns from tragedy into something closer to catastrophe. Closet did what every trained physician in Vienna would have done. He bled him. A lancet opened a vein, and blood was drawn off in quantity. The standard treatment for inflammatory fever, designed to reduce the heat by reducing the blood. Then again. Alongside the bloodletting came enemas and laxatives, stripping the body of whatever fluid reserves remained. Mozart was already swollen, feverish, and bedridden. Closet's treatment was draining the last of what he had. On the evening of December 4th, as Mozart's fever climbed, Closet applied cold, wet compresses directly to his head. The logic was sound by the standards of the time. Cool the fever, reduce the inflammation. What it did instead was send a thermal shock through a cardiovascular system that had been systematically depleted over days of bloodletting. Mozart's body had nothing left to absorb it. He lost consciousness. He died shortly after midnight on December 5th, 1791. No rival composer, no secret lodge. A bacterial infection circulating through Vienna that winter. A body carrying damage from childhood, and a doctor following every protocol his era had given him. None of it was enough to keep a 35-year-old man alive. The murder myth exists because we needed it to. Mozart was 35 when he died. He had written over 600 pieces of music. His final work was a Requiem he didn't finish. If you have decided that this man was a divine vessel, a supernatural conduit for something beyond human understanding, then the idea that he was killed by strep and a doctor with a lancet is almost unbearable. It's too small. It doesn't fit the scale of what was lost. So we gave his death a shape it didn't have, a villain, a plot, a meaning proportionate to the loss. What gets erased in that bargain is the actual man. The guy who spent money he didn't have on clothes he didn't need, who played billiards badly and drank too much champagne punch, who wrote letters full of filth that scandalized his Victorian biographers, who worked 18-hour days not because genius flowed through him effortlessly, but because he understood that the music didn't write itself. That man wrote some of the greatest music in human history. The Divine Vessel story was always a construction, built by a marketing-minded father, amplified by romantics who needed a god, weaponized by fascists who needed a martyr. Strip it away, and what you're left with is a human being, comprehensively ordinary in every way except the work, which, if you think about it, is the more remarkable claim. Thank you for watching. There are more of these. The moments where the official record and the physical evidence stop agreeing. If you don't want to miss an episode, consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one.